Flippity flip, and the steak is done.
Big thanks to Masterbuilt for sponsoring this video.
Let's talk about how thick a steak should be. Everybody loves steaks. And it doesn't matter what type of steak person you are, there are so many choices. And if you love one, you probably love another too. But one thing that we're going to focus on today is how thick your steak should be. I've got a beautiful Black Angus T-bone, dry aged for 37 days. Look at this cut. And even through the pellicle, you can see that it has a good amount of intermuscular fat, and that makes for one freaking tasty steak. On this side of the roast, you see the T-bone steak, and on the other side, you see the porterhouse steak. Now all of this makes for one giant roast, and I'm gonna cut it up into steaks so we can figure out what the best thickness is. And I'm gonna do 4 cuts. One steak is half finger thick steak, 1 finger thick steak, a 3 finger thick steak, and a 4 finger thick steak. All of these steaks require a different method of cooking. There's not one method that works for all of them. For instance, if you have a thick steak like this, it needs a longer cooking time. Whereas a thin steak like this is done in a matter of seconds. Let me show you why. This is the smallest steak of them all, and I cut them with a bone saw. Now it still has some fragments of fat. I'm gonna scrape that off carefully, not damaging the meat. And as you can see, there's some blackness there from the bones. I'm gonna use my knife to clean up that steak to make it as good looking as possible. Now of course this is a dry steak, so I'm gonna get rid of some of that. If it doesn't look good, I wanna get rid of a little bit of pellicle right there and leave a thin line of fat on the steak. And now you can see I ended up with a beautiful looking steak. I removed most of the pellicle, but I left some of it on. It's gonna boost the flavors and it's gonna make this steak taste freaking insane. Before I start grilling this steak, we need to talk about seasoning. With a thin steak like this, you only need a little bit of seasoning to enhance the flavors. Normally, I like to season my steak after the fact. If you would let this steak rest, it would turn cold instantly. Season it, grill it, eat it. I'm gonna be cooking on the Masterbuilt smoker, and this thing does just about anything. So in that sense, it's perfect to cook our steaks on. I'm gonna take out the cast iron grill grates, check the charcoal, and I still have plenty of charcoal in the chute, so that's good to go. Now all I need to do is light it up. My cast iron griddle is heated up, you can see the smoke coming off it, and now I'm gonna grease it up with a piece of the beef fat from the dry aged T-bone roast. This is gonna clean up the griddle, and at the same time it's gonna season it. I need that hot cast iron to get a sear on this steak. Because it's so thin, I don't have time, because it's gonna be cooked all the way through if I go at lower temperatures. So I wanna go as hot as I possibly can. And you compare this to the Japanese version of cooking Wagyu. They always cut their steak super thin and then cook it until it has a crust. If you get bubbles like this, you need to press down the meat, make sure that it makes contact with the cast iron plate to get the best sear possible. A few seconds on one side, and when your crust looks like this, it's time to flip. Of course, I'm not gonna place it at the same spot. I want a new hot spot. There we go, and press again. There we have it. Beautiful, delicious steak, almost fried like bacon. You see the juiciness is coming out, the fat rendered out. That is one delicious looking thing. This is our 1 finger thick steak. It has some more mass to it. You got more meat on it. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna trim off that big chunk of fat. I'm gonna get rid of some of that pellicle. I don't want that dry aged flavor to, well, ruin the whole experience by taking over the show. I just want it to balance out, like a little bit there. So I'll trim all of the blackness off. Some of that darkness that sits at the back of this steak. A little bit of that dark spot right there. And then you end up with one beautiful looking steak. This is where seasoning starts to be a question, because the first one I wanted to season up front. Afterwards, there was no room to season. It was straight away done to be eaten at the plate with that crispiness, so no time to rest. But with a thicker steak like this, you could leave it on the board or on a plate for around 10 to 20 seconds, which might just be enough time to let the salt melt if you season afterwards. However, to be safe, I recommend with a thin steak like this to still season up front. And a thicker steak means more seasoning. Now, of course, I could cook that steak on a cast iron grill, but we did an experiment a while ago where we tested all of the surfaces, and the one that stood out the most was the cast iron grill grate with charcoal flavor. So I'm gonna get this off, get the grill grate out, because that steak is chunky enough to hold its own weight on a cast iron grill grate. A quick brush to clean it up, season it with a little bit of dry aged fat. So my steak goes on the hottest part of the grill. I'm looking for a quick short sear on the outside to get the inside of the steak as pink as possible without overcooking the steak. Quick check. And you see this grill works really fast. A completely different result than the first one. I'm gonna put a little bit of aluminum foil on and I'm gonna let this rest for at least half a minute. This is the 2 fingers thick steak and it's gonna need some special attention. I'm gonna need to remove all of the pellicle from the dry aging, because the thicker your steak is, the more impact that pellicle is gonna have on your steak. So I'm gonna need to remove all of the pellicle from this steak, which includes the dark yellow fat. Therefore, I'm gonna need to remove the whole bone from the T-bone. And as you can see, there's a lot more waste on a thick dry-aged steak than you would have on a thin dry-aged steak. I can't just put a steak like that on the grill and just expect it to cook while I'm grilling it. No, I gotta take it a step further. I gotta apply a method to make sure that my steak fully cooks. That's why I'm gonna apply the reverse sear method. And I need to switch up my master build, remove the direct grilling setup and change it over to indirect grilling, or otherwise known as the smoking setup. And of course I'm going to use that opportunity to add a few chunks of smoke wood to add a little bit of extra flavor. And with a thicker steak there also comes a bigger responsibility. People expect you to cook that steak to perfection, so you got to make sure you measure your temperatures. I'm going to insert a thermometer down into the center of the steak. I'm going to set up the temperature of the steak. I'm going to cook an entrecôte and I want to set it to a core temperature of 54 degrees Celsius. I'm not going to season this steak up front, so this can go straight into the grill. I'm going to set it on top of a rack at a high position, and then I can close the lid and let that smoke at a temperature of 120 degrees Celsius. I just got the notification, time to take that steak off the grill. I'm gonna let the steak rest on the board for 10 minutes while the temperature stabilizes. Now I gotta switch up my setup. I'm gonna take out the grill grates, take out the heat deflector, put in the setup for direct heat, turn up the heat. Now the grill's hot. I'm gonna put my steak on the highest spot of the grill. I'm getting a beautiful light brown Maillard effect on my steak, and this thing is starting to look absolutely freaking delicious. That is one good looking steak. I'm gonna season it with a little bit of salt. Since I have a thicker steak, I can add a little bit more salt. This is my 3-finger stick steak. And as you can see, it's almost as thick as a steak roast. And again, I gotta get rid of all of that pellicle, which means I have to take the bone out, get rid of that dry aged fat. One good looking steak. Extremely nice and thick. And this is for the hungry boys amongst us. I'm also gonna need my thermometer right here. Stick it in the center, thickest part of the steak. And then the steak is ready for the barbecue. No seasoning again. Setup is the same way as the 2-finger thick steak. Steak on the highest position and let it smoke at a temperature of 120 degrees Celsius. 54 degrees Celsius core temperature on my steak, which means I need to take this off, and look at that. Immediately you see the advantage of having a thicker steak. I can have this on the barbecue for a longer period of time and add more smoke flavor to it. I'm gonna let the temperature in the steak stabilize. Now I set my master build up for direct grilling. I got direct heat on my cast iron grill grate. I'm gonna sear this steak off. I'm gonna flip that steak in search of that beautiful diamond crust of the sear marks. And look at that. That is one good looking steak. And again, season it with some salt. And the thicker the steak, the more salt you should use. And that is my final steak. I showed you 4 different ways to cook a steak according to the thickness that the steak has. Let's take a closer look at these steaks. The thin steak that grilled up just like bacon does. Let's slice into this and take a look inside. And as to be expected, that steak is fully cooked, just like bacon. And this definitely is crunchy. And then the finger thick steak that has a beautiful thick sear on it. Let's take a look inside. I got a lot of gray area on the outside of the steak, and I have a rare blue steak on the inside. And this is where the trade-off comes. You have to either cook the outside longer with the risk of getting a more gray area to get it fully cooked in the center. And here we have our beautiful 2-finger thick steak. Absolutely gorgeous. Cooked to perfection. Nice crust on the outside, no gray area, beautiful pink on the inside, classic reverse seared steak. And finally, we get to what is almost a roast. 3-finger thick steak. This thing is an absolute monster. Again, cooked to perfection, beautifully pink on the inside. We got a little smoke ring sitting on the outside, and we got those beautiful sear marks sitting on the outside. The thinner steak, absolutely worth trying. The finger thick steak is a compromise. I would recommend not using this thickness of steak. From 2-finger thick, this is starting to look pretty tasty. This is my absolute favorite way to cook. And then finally, what is almost a roast, beautiful steak, super tender, but in my opinion, a little too thick. Steak bacon.